part 2 of 2 on the topic of the transition from the medieval world to the modern world. In this video, we will continue thinking about Arendt's hallmarks of modernity. We will also think about the beginnings of modern political thought with ideas about republics. More specifically, in this video, we will do the following. We will learn about Machiavelli's alteration of classical republican thought to its modern form. To do this, we will look at Aristotle's taxonomy of good governments and bad. We will examine Polybius's cycle of good governments falling into corruption. We will see how mixed government seems to solve this difficulty. We will see Machiavelli's claim that mixed government institutionalizes social class conflict in such a way that it leads to stability and evasion of the Polybian cycle. We will mention Machiavelli's arrangement in the original structure of the United States Constitution. Next, we will talk about Montaigne's embrasure of the newly rediscovered Pyrrhonian skepticism and examine two skeptical strategies. First, we will talk about the tropes as ways of balancing reasons for and against any knowledge proposition. Second, we will examine the problem of the criterion. An implication of the discovery of the New World is that this discovery runs up against Montaigne's skepticism in the sphere of moral philosophy. We will mention two of Montaigne's essays, on habit and on never easily changing a traditional law, one essay, and on the cannibals, another. From there, we will shift to a consideration of science and Galileo's telescope. We will talk about the previous scientific worldview, the Ptolemaic system, and we will discuss Copernicus's revolution and Kepler's improvement on Copernicus's revolution. And then we will talk about the empirical evidence for heliocentrism coming from Galileo's telescope. Finally, we will bring Montaigne's skepticism to bear against Galileo's telescope. Why would any rational person think that Galileo's observations could lead to scientia, that is, absolutely certain scientific knowledge? All of this sets the stage for Descartes and why science needs philosophy, which we will be covering in the next two videos. One facet of the modern world is its increasing fixation on democratic government. Mostly, the modern world has followed the Roman model of popular government rather than the Greek model. A new book about the Romans says that they invented democracy, having formulated popular government prior to the Athenians. It is just that they did not ever coin the word. The popularity of the Roman model of government in the modern world seems to be due to some of the work of the early modern humanists. Remember that these humanists had a renewed interest in all things classical, and more especially, they were fascinated by the Romans. Machiavelli seems particularly important here. He adapted a republican tradition that extends all the way back to Aristotle and even in part to Plato. Aristotle's teacher Plato identifies several good forms of government and several bad forms. Aristotle picks up on this idea and he systematizes it. There are three good forms of government and three corrupt forms of government. Government can be ruled by one, by a few, or by many. We have then three categories: ruled by one, rule by the few, rule by many. Now we add a qualifier to each that makes them either good or corrupt. In a good government, the rulers rule in the interest of everybody. In a corrupt government, the rulers rule in their own interest. These three categories with the qualifiers give us 6 forms of government. 3 good forms and 3 corrupt forms. The good forms are monarchy, aristocracy, and what Aristotle calls polity. Notice that this is not the way it is listed in the chart at the right, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. The corrupt forms have the same number of rulers as the good forms, but in each case, the rulers rule in their own interest. The corrupt forms are tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Again, if you look at the chart, it is right except in the bottom row, rule by the many. And in those 2 boxes, it should read that the good form of government is polity and the corrupt form is democracy. That's the way that Aristotle presents it. Aristotle thought that over time the good forms of government degenerate into the corrupt forms, so that no good form of government can be expected to last very long. The Hellenistic historian Polybius translated these regime types into a cycle of degenerations. In the Polybian cycle, the first form of government is the good form of rule by one, that is, monarchy. Here the ruler rules in the interest of everyone. But in a generation or two, good rulership is corrupted by self-interest, so that the next stage of the cycle is tyranny. Soon there is a response to tyranny from the leading citizens of the state, who replace the tyrant with a group of citizens who rule in the interest of everyone. Again, self-interest corrupts this arrangement so that a new generation of leading citizens comes to rule in their own interest. Aristocracy thus leads to oligarchy. The citizens in general soon react to this corruption of oligarchy and establish a popular rule in which the majority rules in the interest of everybody. Aristotle names this kind of arrangement, as we mentioned before, polity. As you might now be able to guess, self-interest undermines the polity, so that in a new generation, the majority begins to rule in its own interest. Aristotle refers to this political arrangement as democracy. Now, the next step completes the cycle. Democracy tends to be quite disorderly, and the people generally swoon for a strong leader who can reestablish order. And as a result, monarchy is restored. Thus, no good or corrupt form of government endures for very long. Aristotle's answer to this problem of how to make the regime endure is to formulate a mixed government, one that institutes elements of all 3 good forms of government. Using mixed government is thought of as a way to break out of the Polybian cycle. Perhaps you can see in this mixed government arrangement a foreshadowing of the modern republic. That brings us to Machiavelli. Machiavelli is a student of Aristotle's politics, but also of Roman history. And in Roman history, he sees the idea of mixed government reflected in Roman institutions. He also sees in the mixed government something that neither Aristotle nor Polybius had considered. The Romans institutionalized strife between socioeconomic classes with mixed government. The idea of institutionalized strife would actually have been anathema to Plato, Aristotle, or Polybius. And when Machiavelli suggested it, it also turned out to be anathema to his contemporary Christian audience as well. Machiavelli has noticed that the interests of the common people and the interests of the nobles or aristocrats differ. Moreover, these two classes are always in contention with each other. And this contention is essentially what drives the Polybian cycle. The Romans had given separate institutions to each of the classes, and the contentions between the classes were formally institutionalized into mixed government. In other words, the mixed government republic should have an institution of the common people and an institution of the aristocrats. And their respective powers should be balanced against each other and also against a monarchical element. Machiavelli then gives us the first republican theory of balance of power. Machiavelli was quite an important philosophical source to the founders of the United States Constitution. The original government structure created by the Constitution was completely reflective of Machiavelli. There is a president who represents the monarchical form of good government. Then there is a legislative chamber for the two great social classes. Following the Romans, the aristocratic house is called the Senate. The people's house is the House of Representatives. This arrangement, however, has been altered by two modern events. The first is the legal case of Marbury versus Madison. In it, the Supreme Court elevated itself in power to the equivalent not only of the president, but also of the combined legislative chambers. This is not part of the court's original constitutional jurisdiction. The second event is the passage of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. In it, the senators lose their aristocratic status by now becoming elected directly by the people. Prior to that, they had been elected by their state legislatures. This might seem to elevate the status of the ordinary people and reduce the influence of elites, but contemporary assessments of the government suggest exactly the opposite. The claim being advanced these days is that the United States government is coming closer and closer to being an oligarchy than a popular government. Machiavelli's political vision of the world is one in which political harmony, called for in the classical political philosophy and in medieval Christian political philosophy, and for that matter, in Confucian political philosophy, is seen as a hopeless ideal. Real political philosophy should recognize that reality of the political world is strife. The reality of the political world is strife, contention, and disharmony. And that we should organize politics to reflect this. We should also say that Machiavelli's vision of modern politics has won the day in the modern world. Let us now turn to another feature that arises as the world transforms from the medieval to the modern, the place of doubt. Modern times are ushered in by skepticism. We've already seen some of that in Machiavelli, where he doubts the possibility of political unity and social harmony. A more thoroughgoing skeptic is the inventor of the literary form of the essay, Michel de Montaigne. Classical skeptical writings had been rediscovered in Montaigne's day, and he is the first strong advocate of modern skepticism. Remember that we had previously suggested that knowledge is JTB, justified true belief. Skepticism doubts that there can be a final justification, J, for knowledge, and it produces arguments against justification for knowledge claims. One of the newly rediscovered classical skeptical strategies for supporting doubt suggests that we are able to find equally strong reasons for and against any claim to knowledge. The reasonable thing to do then, given these equally balanced reasons for and against any proposition, is to suspend one's judgment on the matter. This is the first strategy introduced by Sextus Empiricus in his presentation of the skepticism of the classical skeptic Pyrrho. A much more formidable difficulty presented by the classical skeptics is the problem of the criterion. With this, the skeptic seems to show that the justification for any knowledge claim ends in circularity, an infinite regress, or an arbitrary assertion. None of which seems to be acceptable to advocates of knowledge. Say that you wanted to support some claim of knowledge. Let's call it K as being true. Then you would need a criterion or standard of truth. Let's call it C, against which to measure K. But how do you know that C is a true standard? Perhaps C tells you that it is true. But if this is the case, then you have engaged in circular reasoning. The reason that is supposed to support your conclusion is actually the conclusion. Suppose you say that C is supported by some other standard, say C prime. Then the question becomes, how do we know that C prime is a true standard? Well, maybe C prime is justified by C double prime, and so on, and so on. Clearly, we are on the path of an infinite regress of standards here. What else might we say about K's being true? You might simply pound your fist and raise your voice saying, K is true. This, however, is an arbitrary assertion. My fist-pounding counter-assertion, K is not true, is equally as justified, but they both cannot be true. At this point, the skeptic's doubts may seem warranted. Your attempts to justify your knowledge claims seem to end in circularity, an infinite regress, or an arbitrary assertion. Montaigne had been a public official in Bordeaux, France, but gave it up to retire to his chateau, where he took up his pen to essay or test his opinions on religion, politics, law, but most especially with respect to what he thought he knew about his own self. One area he brought his skepticism to bear against is morality. And the European discovery of the New World supplied topics against which to essay. Montaigne was fascinated by the cannibals discovered by Europeans living in Brazil. He was at the same time horrified by the massacres perpetrated by the European conquistadors in the New World. In his essay on the cannibals, Montaigne seems to suggest that the virtue of the cannibals actually exceeded that of the Europeans who conquered them. Like many other Europeans, Montaigne was captivated by the challenge to conventional European morality that the diversity of customs discovered in the New World represented. In his essay of Custom and Not Easily Changing an Accepted Law, Montaigne gives an extensive list of human practices that were considered appropriate by the people practicing them. These include various forms of incest and murder and much more. Montaigne is giving a skeptical challenge to those who hold to some kind of claim of absolute moral standards. In particular, he is taking on the natural law tradition, which suggests that all peoples everywhere are capable of discovering the rules of right conduct through rational reflection. At the beginning of modernity, Machiavelli and Montaigne seem to jar some of the stability of the medieval worldview. If it hadn't been enough to discover that European culture is hardly at the center of the world, a newly materializing scientific movement put forward a challenge to the accepted claim that the human world is at the center of the universe. The medieval cosmological worldview that was accepted by the church and that had been beautifully included in Dante's Paradiso was called the Ptolemaic system. It placed the earth at the center of things with heavenly spheres that rotated around it. That worldview faced an intellectual revolution in the Polish mathematician and astronomer Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus devised a parallel system to the Ptolemaic system, but he replaced Earth at the center of things with the sun. Now, since the church officially espoused the Ptolemaic system, we might think that Copernicus would have fallen out of good standing with the church for the presentation of the heliocentric system. Remember that during the time period in which Copernicus lived, there was homogeneous church orthodoxy. Everybody believed the same things. In fact, Copernicus did not run astray of the church in the way that Galileo later would. The reason is that he presented his system as an elegant mathematical theory only. He made no ontological claim about the heliocentric system. By ontological, I mean that he made no claim about the ways that things actually are. He only claimed that if things were like this, they would have simpler mathematical qualities. For all its greatness, Copernicus' system remains too closely aligned to the Ptolemaic system. He replaced one system of concentric circles with another system of concentric circles. Copernicus, it would seem, has not quite separated his scientific endeavors from his religious beliefs. He has likely retained the circle, even though it raises mathematical difficulties because of the perfection associated with circles, and God's creation must be perfect. It is up to the next figure of history, Johannes Kepler, to correct for this. And correct for it he did. Kepler theorized correctly, as it turns out, that the solar satellites orbit the sun in elliptical motions, with the sun sitting at the position of one focus of an ellipse. This became an element of Kepler's famous principles of planetary motion. Galilei discovered satellites orbiting Jupiter, and he wrote to Kepler to get his opinion about the discovery. Kepler, upon hearing about this, decided that he had to have access, as Galileo did, to a telescope. And that brings us to the last, and the third and the last of Hannah Arendt's hallmarks of modernity, Galileo's telescope. With this powerful device, Galileo was able to observe the moons of Jupiter, something that the Ptolemaic system just doesn't allow for. He was also able to observe the phases of Venus, something that Copernicus' system had predicted. It looked as if Galileo's observational justification for the heliocentric view, and Galileo asserted that the heliocentric system was physically true. Let me read that again. It looked as if Galileo's observational justification for the heliocentric view was upheld. And he asserted that, in fact, not only was the heliocentric system an elegant theory, but it was also physically true. Eventually, this opinion landed him in trouble with the Pope and with the Jesuits of the Counter-Reformation. He was sentenced to house arrest for heresy. When René Descartes heard of Galileo's house arrest, he suppressed publication of his first book, Le Monde, which also advocated a Copernican-style heliocentric system. Now, what if we turn Montaigne's skepticism on Galileo's telescope? If we lived in the time period, why should we reasonably believe that the telescope reveals truth any more than a kaleidoscope? Why is it unreasonable to assert that Galileo had some kind of a magic tube, a piece of deceptive witchcraft, and not an apparatus for making true observations? Perhaps René Descartes can give us some answers here, and that will be the topic. That will be an issue that we bring up in the next couple of videos. Now we have finished our investigation of the transition from the medieval world to the modern. In this video, we have examined the Republican ideas of Machiavelli and the skeptical ideas of Montaigne, and we have looked at the advent of early science of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. The end.